Hey guys, welcome back to another video here on Sarah's Tech Lab. So every year there is this one month in the year that's absolutely filled to the brim with tech events. And that month is September. People in the tech world call it Techtember because of all the tech events that happen in that month. So today, since September just ended, I think it's October 2nd today, we're going to be going over some of the biggest tech events that happened last month. But before we get into that, I was looking at my YouTube analytics and it turns out that over 80% of my viewers aren't subscribed to me. So before we get into the news, I would really appreciate if you could hit that subscribe button down below as well as leave a like. But without any further ado, let's get into the video. Alright, so first things first, let's start with the folding phones. So in September, there were 3 different folding phones that were announced, and they were all really big. So the first one is the Moto Razr 2. So you might remember your flip phones from back in the day when Motorola had their Motorola Razr. That was a really popular flip phone. And recently Motorola actually created another flip phone, except this time it's a folding phone. So it's an all-screen folding phone and it folds into this small compact form factor that you can fit in your pocket. So last year they released their first model and it sold for around $1,400, and this year they released their second model and there were a couple of improvements, but none of them were really major. Essentially they just boosted the hinge, they made it a little better, and they upgraded the specs on the camera and they just made it a bit more usable, but I still don't think this is 100% a usable phone because there are a lot of better alternatives out there. Next we have the Surface Duo. So you might remember Microsoft making Windows phones like a few years back, but none of them were really successful. So this time they started making phones again, except they're partnering with Nokia, and this time they're using Androids instead of their own Windows software. So their first entry into the market in 5 years was a folding phone called the Surface Duo. And the highlight of the Surface Duo is instead of having a folding screen in the middle, there are 2 separate screens on like 2 different parts of the phone that can fold. So that means that you can have the phone in all these different form factors and you can like bend it in all different ways, and the hinge is a really good part of the phone, but it still isn't really that usable because it has last year's specs and it has a pretty bad camera. But still, it's really interesting to see Microsoft's take on folding phones completely different from anything we've seen so far. So I'm sure next year the new Surface Duo 2 will be a really big phone. And finally for folding phones, we have the Galaxy folding phone. So last year, Samsung was one of the first companies to release their folding phone. They released the Galaxy Fold, and this year they released the Galaxy Z Fold 2. So essentially it's an updated version of the last Fold. This time it's way more usable. This is going to be your best folding phone on the market, but it is still around $2,000, which is really expensive. So essentially they of course boosted all the specs. It has a Qualcomm 875 and it has a full screen on the front, which means that instead of having a tiny screen on the front that's really unusable, it has a full screen on the front that if you wanted to, you could use just the front screen and not even open the phone. And the inside is also fixed. So last year there was a screen protector on their screens where if you try to take it off, it would just break the phone. So this year you can take off the screen protector, but you have to go into like the Samsung store to get it done. But it's still great to see that improvement has been made. So of course we had the folding phones, the really high-end phones this year, but some things that we didn't really see that much of were innovative and new budget phones. Which means that in September, Google and Samsung took that opportunity and released their new mid-tier phones. So Google announced the Pixel 5. You might remember Google announced their Pixel 4a earlier this year, and that was a really big hit. It's around $400, has a lot of great specs, a really good camera, and is overall one of the best budget phones you can buy. Well, now they released their Pixel 5, and instead of being one of the high-end flagship phones, the Google Pixel 5 is more of a mid-tier phone. It starts at right around $700 and it has some really good specs. Now, of course, being a mid-tier phone, Google pivoted from their normal high-end flagship phones, and now they had to cut down on a few things. Namely, they cut down on the overall build of the phone, and they cut down on the chip. So it has a Qualcomm 765, which is not the highest end chip, but it's still really good. It has a really good screen, an all screen front, and it also has a plastic back, I believe, but that's not 100% sure because they haven't shipped it out to anyone. There's no reviews yet, but it seems like it's a plastic back so far. So this is going to be a really interesting phone, and especially now that Google is catering more to the mid and budget end of phones instead of the high-end phones that they used to make. This is a really interesting turn of events, and it's going to be really cool to see what Google does with that in the future. Next up, Samsung released their Galaxy S20 Fan Edition. So honestly, I think that this is one of the best phones you can buy in that price range. So essentially, it's just a Galaxy S20, which is above $1,000 right now, but this one comes in at right around $700. So it's competing with right around the Pixel 5 budget, and it's going to be really interesting to see which phone sells more of. But honestly, I think the S20 Fan Edition looks a lot better. So the only drawbacks of this phone are number one, the cameras, and number two, the plastic back. So the plastic back, I mean, it's going to be covered up with the case most of the time, but it's just a little bit. So the plastic back is probably going to be covered up with a case most of the time, but it's still good to know that it's a plastic back and not a glass back like some of the more premium phones on the market. And the camera, although the camera isn't as good as some of the flagship phones, it still is one of the best cameras. It has a triple array of cameras. It has a 12.2 megapixel, a 12 megapixel, and an 8 megapixel, and it has telephoto and wide angle. So this is going to be pretty much what you would expect from a normal high-end phone. So it's really good to see that these cameras are going down to the more mid-end. Other than that, it does have a Qualcomm 865, which is the flagship chip. It's really fast, so it's really good to see that. It also has a bigger battery than the normal Galaxy S20 lineup. I think it's around 4,500 milliamp hours, which is a really good battery. So Apple's event is probably going to be sometime in October, and they are rumored to be releasing a budget phone or a mid-tier phone as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see how Apple is going to be competing with Samsung and Google and what features they're going to have to offer. Speaking of Apple, Apple recently had their September event in which they released a few more devices. Namely, they updated their Apple Watch and their iPad lineups. So for the Apple Watch, they released the Apple Watch Series 6, which honestly is pretty much the same as last year. It just has a new blood oxygen sensor and has a brighter display. Other than that, they released their Solo loops, which are basically just the normal silicone loops, except they have like a stretchiness to them, so you can just stretch it over your band. And they also have a new wool version of that. But the more important Apple Watch that Apple released this year was the Apple Watch SE. So this is the first time that we're seeing a budget end of the Apple Watch. So essentially, it's a Series 6 that has the same specs and the same chip. It just doesn't have the always on display, and it's missing the ECG and the blood oxygen sensor. So it's really interesting to see Apple branch off their Apple Watches into a budget and high-end version. And I think the Apple Watch series and I think the Apple Watch SE is a really good deal because you're getting a pretty good price for the specs that it has. So they also updated their iPad lineup. First, they updated their normal $329 iPad, which now has the iPad 8th generation, and essentially they gave it the A12 Bionic chip, which makes it a lot faster than it was before, which is really good to see. Other than that, it's pretty much the same as last year. They also released their iPad Air update, in which it's going to be pretty much just like an iPad Pro. It has the boxy design, it has an all-screen display, it has a Touch ID actually, it comes in a bunch of different colors, and it also has Apple Pencil 2 support. And all of that with the A14 Bionic chip make it almost as fast as the iPad Pro. And it's also only $600. So this is a really good price that Apple has been putting out, and I think this is going to be a really good and amazing tool for designers and people who like using their iPad instead of their computer. Of course, they also had their iOS 14 and iPad OS 14, as well as their watchOS 7. I made a video on iOS 14 a while back, so if you want to check that out, I'll link it down in the description below. But watchOS 7 made the Apple Watches a lot more snappier, and they made the animations shorter, so your Apple Watches will now be even faster. Okay, so next up we have the Xbox and the PS5. So Xbox and PS5 are currently releasing their new gen consoles. For Xbox, they're releasing the Series S and the Series X. So the Series S is going to be $300, which is a really good price. It's going to have some pretty good specs. This is what it looks like up here. It's pretty much just a traditional Xbox. It's just updated with new gen specs, and that's going to be the one that most people are buying. But the Xbox Series X is going to look like this. So it has a much more square design, which makes it look kind of weird, but it still looks pretty cool because it's an Xbox, of course. And it has some insane specs, like it has a 12 teraflop GPU, which is insane for really intensive, really graphics intensive games. So it's going to be interesting how the new console generation is going to be playing out and how Xbox is going to be competing with PlayStation. So for PlayStation, they released their PS5. It doesn't have a high-end and cheap-end model, but it does have an all-digital version and a CD version. So the all-digital version is $400, and the CD slot one is going to be $500. That's what it's going to look like. It looks really cool in my opinion, and honestly it looks like it's right out of like an alien spaceship. It just looks insane, but we haven't seen any real gameplay of this yet, but that's what it's going to look like, and we know that the specs are going to be pretty good, and we also know that the price is $500 and $400. So as these models are going to be actually released and available to buy and pre-order, it's going to be really interesting to see which one sells more of and how the Xbox versus PlayStation conflict plays out. Anyways, that's about it for today's video. There was a ton of news that happened this month that I couldn't possibly fit into this video, but there were things like the Lucid Air launch, the Tesla Battery Day, Amazon released a security drone that flies inside your house, Google had their smart home event. If you want me to make another video about all of that news, maybe I make a Techtember review part 2, let me know down in the comments below. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't already, as well as turn on the notification bell. Anyways, that's been it. I'll see you guys next time on the next episode of Sarah's Tech Lab. Bye.